The Matrix Resurrections. All right. I know the audience out there is somewhat split on the fact that this movie, the fourth movie in one of the best trilogies ever, of this fourth movie even existing, even being a thing. And here's my take on that. When it comes to this money grab, art being pushed to the back seat, studio heads only focusing on the bottom line, and not just studio heads, could be certain creatives involved that are just in the mindset of a money grab type of situation. When it comes to that type of trend that seems so prevalent nowadays in Hollywood and beyond, I personally am not the biggest fan. When it comes to like remakes and reboots, very skeptical going in, right? I still give stuff a chance, but my guards are definitely up. And my apprehension to these is way more so when it comes to movies that are just straight remakes. You're taking an older movie, recasting it, and reshooting the same exact thing. That's like, for me, like at the top of the list of this type of trend, right? Then under that, I would put just like reboots in general of like an older concept or idea that I'm just kind of like, I don't know. That has proven me right and wrong in the past, right? So I'm speaking of like Saved by the Bell, for example. Back in the day, they had, I forgot what it was called. It was Saved by the Bell, the New Class or something like that. That was just like a straight money grab, right? And just trying again to like keep that same concept and idea, recast it, but at least it wasn't just like reshooting the same exact like episodes and stuff of the past. Man, that kind of sucked. Then the latest reboot, which is the like Saved by the Bell, like within that same world, just showing all of them older and now, you know, teachers and etc. that I've spoken about here on the show. That was all right. That was pretty good. Not great, but pretty good in my opinion. Or like Cobra Kai, taking like this Karate Kid movies from back in the day, and which again I'm going to speak about in a future episode because I just finished watching fairly recently the latest season of it, and I thought that was great. They like knocked it out the park in my opinion. So like stuff like that, right? Then you have just trilogies, or you know, it could be a single movie and they just do like a part 2 to it just because it's so popular, the first one, or part 3, etc. Think like Hangover, for example. Like that was such a huge success that they made a part 2, which was also funny, and part 3, which was a little bit less so. But like that type of thing, those I'm not as mad at, you know? But then you have something iconic like The Matrix, like a Back to the Future. And in these scenarios, when they do decide to make a new installation to the series, I'm a little split on it. As a fan, excited because I love this world. I want to see what else is going on in it, you know, where the story has progressed to. But then part of me is like, damn, but I don't want them to fuck up the legacy of what it is, the iconicness, if that's a word, which I don't think it is. But you guys know what I mean, right? But then I take a step back and I'm like, everything that the Matrix was or is, and I felt this way, there was something recently that I actually spoke about on the podcast. It's escaping me now, but like a sequel like this that came after many years. And I believe it had like the same type of energy, which was the greatness of it is solidified. If the fourth movie is absolute shit, it doesn't mean that, oh, fuck, now they fucked up the series and it's not like a once bad apple spoils the bunch type of situation where now all the other movies are shit. Like, nah, the other 3 movies are still ill. It's still awesome. It still did what it did. They still mean what they mean. And the fourth installation doesn't have to add to it, doesn't have to take away from it. I could kind of like separate it. You know what I mean? So on this torn type of mentality that I go into a movie like Matrix Resurrections with, I'm a little more on the optimistic side, and I welcome it. And then when the movie turns out to be fucking great, as I believe The Matrix Resurrections was, it's just that much better. You know, it's like that much more gratifying. So let's give it up a little bit to The Matrix Resurrections. Now, those of you that listen to the podcast know how I feel about The Matrix. I love the series. The first movie was just up there on like my favorite movies of all time. I spoke about on a recent episode or a past episode rather, I don't remember how recent it is, that Matrix E should be its own type of genre for movies, where if you say that to people, people know like what you mean by it. I think it was when I was speaking about Free Guy, that it has like it's kind of Matrixy. And if you say that to people, they'll be like, oh yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Like it created that aside from just the innovative visual effects that were born out of this movie that are still used today, and that we saw dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of movies and fight scenes use ever since, which was that concept of having cameras lined all the way around so you could see like that 360 view of like a fight scene. That was Matrix innovation. And because the Matrix is on such a high pedestal for me, I welcomed this Matrix Resurrections, but my expectations weren't high. I was like, there's no way. And by the way, just to be very clear, I don't think Matrix Resurrections topped the Matrix, like the original, by any stretch. But I had no expectations. I was like, this is probably going to be like just fun to watch just based on the nostalgia, but probably going to suck. But it wasn't that at all. It was so good, so creative. And I can't wait to tell you guys a bit about like my favorite parts from it. But first, let me read you guys the official synopsis. Return to a world of two realities. One, everyday life. The other, what lies behind it. To find out if his reality is a construct, to truly know himself, Mr. Anderson will have to choose to follow the White Rabbit once more. The story is based on characters created by Lily and Lana Wachowski, which, fun fact, for those of you who may not know, the Wachowski brothers were the ones who wrote and created the original Matrix. And they have since transitioned, both of them, into Lily and Lana Wachowski, respectively, and now go by the Wachowskis. Lana Wachowski also directed this one. And in terms of writing credits for The Matrix Resurrections, we have Lana Wachowski, David Mitchell, and Alexander Himan. And before I tell you guys about some of my favorite parts of the movie, I just want to say that in terms of The Matrix, I feel like, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, but it made like a generation of people feel like someone gets me. Or like, oh, I'm not alone in the way that I think sometimes. And I don't know exactly how to pinpoint or describe that feeling, but I'm sure that those of you that felt that way or a similar way with watching the original Matrix know exactly what I mean. And this new movie, I feel, helps do that for a fresh new generation that might not go back and watch like the original Matrix, for example. And that's pretty cool. Oh yeah, and if you guys are new listeners to the show and you may not be familiar with my little recaps and reviews of movies, there definitely are spoilers. So spoiler alert. Feel free to fast forward if you haven't seen the movie yet. So when the movie starts off, we see Neo, Keanu Reeves, who, by the way, is definitely a vampire. This guy does not get old. And he's a white dude, which, no offense, but historically do not age well. You know what I mean? It's not like a Lorenz Tate that is also definitely a vampire, but has the whole black don't crack thing going on. It opens up with Keanu living a life that's reminiscent of his Mr. Anderson Matrix life before he was unplugged. And this is not like the very first scene of the movie, which I'm going to circle back to, but just like the first time we're introduced to Neo's character. But he seems to be like in a corner office type of situation, looks successful in terms of like financially, has a lot of like awards, game awards, and like paraphernalia from the Matrix, like action kind of figures and little statues of like Sentinels and the character of Trinity in an iconic scene of when she jumps out of the window backwards and she's shooting up at an agent that is coming down after her. And we learned that he's a game programmer that's renowned for creating a video game called The Matrix. And at first when this is going on, I'm like, please don't fuck this up. Please don't fuck this up. I thought they were just going to go the route of saying, oh, the last three movies were just, you know, really the video game that this guy created. And then just go on to show that, you know, none of the other stuff actually happened. And I was like, please don't do that. But they do a good job of building up that type of suspense throughout the movie, or at least like the beginning quarter of the movie, by showing Neo going to therapy sessions, and his therapist is played by Neil Patrick Harris. Shout out to NPH, who does an amazing job. And in one of the first sessions between them, probably the first, the therapist gives him some very sound, rational, logical, psychological feedback based on the information that Neo is giving him about this other world that he thinks he's been a part of, and, you know, Trinity and Morpheus and et cetera, et cetera. And the therapist, again, very rationally writes it all off in a coherent way that makes sense, which we later find out is obviously like complete bullshit and untrue. But it's so interesting, I think, just like taking a snapshot of that moment of how anybody without any knowledge of the outside story or who Neo is, etc., or, you know, just taking this moment between like two people, you'd be like, oh yeah, that guy's obviously a whack job. He's completely crazy. And what this doctor therapist dude is saying is obviously correct. But it's like the exact opposite. And I just thought that was like a very interesting scene in that sense, and when looked at that way. And NPH's character is meant to symbolize control. He is the architect character of the previous Matrix movies. But in this iteration of the Matrix, he's known as the Analyst. Would you guys remember the architect from the older movies? He's dressed all in white, kind of looks like Colonel Sanders. Doogie Howser is like the 2.0 version of him. But Neo is going through the motions, similar, and this is the part where I felt like it was like reminiscent of the first movie, you know, going through the motions in this world where he doesn't quite feel like he belongs and he feels out of place. And, you know, there's even a montage of him just going through, you know, the same routines over and over again. Going to the gym, going to work, going to the coffee shop that he likes, taking his medication, which happens to be a blue pill. Keep him in that blue pill world, if you will. And that's a throwback, you know, symbolizing the choice of taking the red pill or the red pill to know the truth, the blue pill to stay within the Matrix. And you can tell that he himself feels like something's off. But the writers do a great job of keeping us as the audience in suspense of, wait, is this motherfucker actually crazy? And he just invented like this dope game with his psychosis. Like, what the hell's going on? And then we're introduced to probably the most memorable character, one of the most memorable characters, obviously outside of Neo and Trinity, etc., of this new movie, which was Bugs, played by Jessica Henwick. And by then, by the way, I don't mean chronologically, because she was actually within the very first scene of the movie. But in that scene, we see the type of dichotomy that we're used to seeing within the Matrix, like the two worlds, the plugged in world and those that have escaped it and are outside of it and are, you know, being hunted, if you will, by the agents. And she's running away from a couple agents, stumbles onto a scene that was from the original Matrix with Trinity, when I think it was the opening scene of the first movie, if I'm not mistaken. But it was like an exact remake of the scene where Trinity is in this abandoned warehouse type of place. She fucks up like a bunch of cops to like get out of there, and the agents are like going to get her, and it's like in the original movie, like the first time we see Agent Smith, and the cops are like, oh, I sent two squads up to go get her, you know, we can take care of one little girl. And Agent Smith turns around and says, no, Lieutenant, your men are already dead. And they like redo that line in this movie, which they have a lot of like kind of like callbacks to like the original, like that, like sprinkled throughout the movie, which is pretty cool. Definitely checks off the nostalgia box. But anyway, so Bugs is like on the outside looking in on this like scene, and she's like, wait, I've seen this before. What is this? Oh, this is the moment. This is like where it all started, whatever, blah, blah, blah. What is this? Where am I? Kind of like thing. She's speaking to her team, her crew, specifically to Seek, which is another character, which is pretty cool in the movie. And just shows like from a technological perspective where we're at nowadays, where Seek is able to like project the hologram of himself into, you know, whatever situation she's like plugged into, Bugs in this case. But his actual being, his actual body is back on like their ship, like their, I forget the name of the ship, but like their version of the Nebuchadnezzar. And he's like who Tank was in the first movie, you know, like the operator, their eyes and ears, if you will. That lets them know like when trouble's coming, etc. So long story, a little bit less long. This scene is being recreated within a game that Neo's character designed, like a section within a game that he designed or is working on. And Bugs stumbles upon this, and she's like within it. And the agents somehow like wind up noticing her as well. And, they're going through the motions of like what they did with Trinity in the original movie, like in this scene. And she goes through some like back doors and gets away essentially. But the takeaway from the scene, which is what I wanted to get to, is something that got me really excited right away, which was that this was a modal. She called it a modal, which is a simulation used to evolve programs. Now, I want to put a pin in my little recap and review and take a quick aside to explain why this got me so excited. So I've had this thought, this concept, this idea, not even sure exactly what to call it, but just like when when you're like in the creative space, you're like, could be thinking about a story, but just like thinking of like just things in general. Just could be thinking about technology or AI or the meaning of life or the natural progression of things. I don't know what exactly, but I've had this thought where it's not a completely thought out, fleshed out type of idea, so take it with a grain of salt. But this kind of concept or idea of if there is a God, maybe higher entities, multiple deities, who knows, right? But if there was something consciously above us, and by us, I mean, you listening to this, me, like the world as we know it. And if there's really like a multiverse and that conscious being or those conscious beings are above that, and we're somehow like contributors to whatever's going on in their world, if that makes any sense. Like how we could create in our world, how we can create a program or like a script or a function within Excel to process a certain set of commands, or how we created the calculator to be able to calculate numbers instantly and faster than we could compute in our own brains, right? So we create things to benefit us. So what if we're creating things to benefit them, like those beings above us, right? So I had this thought of, it'll be interesting if, let's hypothetically say something like that is the case, and they kind of create these separate worlds where they could all be different. Like in our world, humans are top of the food chain, quote unquote. In another world, maybe it's fucking ducks like Howard the Duck, or beings that are not carbon based, they're fucking nitrogen based. You know what I mean? Like they mix and match like different things and just create like different worlds, right? Like with the idea of, let's see what these ingredients come up with. And in our world, the ingredients made carbon based organisms and stars and planets, and we come from stardust, and we've evolved and we continue to evolve from monkeys, apes, hominids into Homo sapiens and so on and so forth, right? And we, create all these different things, and we're heavy into technology right now. We're working on possibly creating AI, etc. But it's all based on like these ingredients, right? That those beings above us initially started. So my idea is like, what if they do that just to see like all the cool, different, useful shit that comes out of those worlds, and then they're like, oh, and they replicate that in their world, or they take it and, use it in their world somehow. So I've had that type of like thought or idea, unbeknownst to me, that if this modal thing was not just something created for like this world within the Matrix, I don't know if it's something that actually exists within like the computer programming world, but that concept was still the same, which was a simulation used to evolve programs. And it's like Neo created this world, this modal, to like recreate Morpheus, for example, came from this, or a version of him, where this scenario kept repeating itself over and over and over and over again. But one of the characters, which was an agent, that was a mix between Agent Smith and Morpheus, came out of it. Morpheus 2.0, if you will. But because I've had that thought, that idea in the past, that really resonated with me, and I thought it was so cool. Now, back to the rest of my little recap and review. So after this scene, we pretty much find out that, again, that dual world exists. The Matrix world and the real world. And that Neo is somehow back in the Matrix. He's plugged in again. And there's this subset of people that think that Neo died, doesn't, he's gone, that's it. And there's another subset of people that believe that he's still alive, that the spirit of the one is still going on somehow. And Bugs is one of those people that believe. But like we saw at the end of the trilogy, Neo died. He sacrificed himself with some Christian-like symbolism that he gave his life for others. So you're kind of like, there's a disconnect there, right? You're like, what the fuck? What's going on? Then, much like in the first movie, there is an attempt to save Neo, to unplug him. And he's a little torn. He's like, wait, I thought it was crazy. I'm going to therapy, but this world doesn't feel right. I guess the Matrix was real. Let me kind of like go with it. And they get him the fuck out of there. And they even, it's a very similar red pill, blue pill situation. Morpheus comes into the picture, the new Morpheus / Agent Smith, played by Yahya Abdul-Mateen II. And then we find that the Agent Smith type character, remember that he was kind of like disconnected from the Matrix, and the machines used Neo being like the connection between Agent Smith and the machine world, since Agent Smith kind of turned into a virus and started just like replicating himself, but the machines couldn't control him anymore. But Neo was kind of like that connection to him. The machines were able to, quote unquote, erase his program. But nonetheless, he does exist once again in this movie. And he's played by Jonathan Groff, which was the FBI agent in the Netflix series that they canceled, that I was upset about that they canceled after just 2 seasons, because apparently nobody but me was watching it, called Mindhunter. And he plays like this new version of Agent Smith, which is just Smith. He's not an agent of the machines, but he embodies like that Agent Smith character. And he does a great job. He does a really good job, Jonathan Groff, because he like makes it his own, similar by the way to Yahya Abdul-Mateen, who plays the new like Morpheus / Agent Smith 2.0. Like they both do great jobs in making the characters, these new characters or versions of those characters, like their own, without just, like seemingly doing an impression of the previous characters. And Smith's character plays Neo's business partner in the like video game fucking company that they have. And there's actually a funny scene between them two where Smith is telling, they're speaking about their parent company, Warner Brothers, which is the actual like parent company of the Matrix franchise. How they said that they wanted them to do a reboot of the Matrix, and if they didn't do it, that they would move on without them and have somebody else do it, which was the case for Lana Wachowski, apparently. Warner Brothers has been hounding her to make a 4th Matrix, and she didn't want to, and they were like, all right, fuck it, we're going to do it without you, then we own this shit. And then she was like, all right. Before you guys fuck it up, let me do it. But anyway, I got to wrap this up soon because I'm just going on and on, but I thought it was so good. So when they rescue Neo, he's back on the ship, whatever this cruise Nebuchadnezzar is, and he starts finding out things, and we as an audience start finding out things along with him. Like the fact that the machines were able to, when Neo died, they were able to, and the Analyst kind of reveals this later on, so it's not like immediately after. But just in the interest of time, the machines were able to, when Neo died, were able to piece him back together. They spent like years getting his like brain and his eyes. Remember, his eyes were like burned off, and like rebuilding his body basically to give him life again and plug him back into the Matrix, which is how he wound up plugged in again in the first place. And that it's been like 60 or 70 years since then. So this isn't like immediately after either. And this new Matrix has been going on for like 60, 70 years. But him, and we'll later see Trinity being replugged in, like they didn't age along with everyone else. And we find out that they were giving him this life of like being this Matrix game designer guy to kind of like fuck with his head in how that he's crazy basically. And like that's how they kept him under control. That's how they would keep him under control, because they knew that, he would have these feelings and thoughts, and they wanted a way to explain that way. And there was a really dope line that Bugs tells them, which is that they took his life and made it into a video game. They turned it into something so trivial. And the Matrix in so many ways is a metaphor for our own world, our own lives. So something like that could definitely be said about the way we trivialize things and treat our lives. But let me fast forward a bit. So then we find out what has been going on over these past like 60 years. So after the incident with Neo when he died, there was peace for a long time. And it came from there being a civil war within the machine world. And they even they showed flashback scenes of this. And there's red lasers versus blue lasers, kind of, like red pill, blue pill. That's a theme throughout. And that was pretty cool. But it gave birth to this concept, this idea that we find in this movie where it's not just human versus machine anymore. It's not just freeing the minds of humans from the machines. There are also sentient machines that are good and that work with the people, and that they are able to be freed from their programming and be free in this new world as well. And then we find out that Zion no longer exists. Now it's a place called IO, which is symbolism for ones and zeros of the computer world. And also it's the middle two letters of Zion. And Jada Pinkett is in it, and she's 60 years older, and she's the general. And I love the callback to a bunch of the different characters, a few of which I'm going to listen to a bit. But she's the one that puts Neo on to what happened with the Civil War, and then after that there's been peace, and how working with the sentient machines that are now integrated in part of their world, they were able to become so much more advanced than folks were in Zion. In IO, they're growing plants and fruits like strawberries, and they have all these pleasures that they couldn't have back in Zion because they have this technological AI advantage with working with these sentient computer beings. And what was one of the coolest characters in this entire movie, it's not just one character specifically, but just this concept, this idea, is that these machines, this AI, if you will, that they free this software, the programming of the software, right? But how does that translate into the real world where IO is? So these sentient beings are able to physically appear and manifest in that real world through this magnetic beads type of thing. I forget what they call it, but these malleable magnetic beads, and they take the shape of the face and body of a human being in the real world, which I'm doing a shit job, I just realized, of explaining that, but it's so cool. Such a cool concept. That definitely answers the question of okay, you just freed, the mind, quote unquote, of this program, but how does that computer program manifest itself in the real world? This answered that question. So other characters that are in it, Sati, the little girl, remember the little girl from that train station from nowhere in the second or third movie, I want to say? She's in it. I think the third movie. She's in it, but all grown up, obviously. The Frenchman makes a cameo. A really cool line that Neil Patrick Harris said in the movie, which I jotted down here separately, was just that feelings validate our fictions. I thought that was pretty cool. Oh, you know who else is in it? Aunt Rachel from Family Matters. You guys remember Family Matters? She's in it. Oh, and something that I thought was awesome too, and kind of validated for me, because it's something it's a concept that I wrote about in my debut novel, FRACTAL, A Time Travel Tale, where the crew within my book, the way they're able to toggle through time is through their dreams. But the way that they get back to baseline reality is by looking in a mirror. And I forget the exact verbiage that I used in the novel to describe how that worked. But basically it rejiggered their neurons such that it allowed them to return back to their baseline reality. And in this movie, they also use mirrors, which is also, by the way, not an original idea. I mean, it's original in the ways that it's used, but it's a Alice in Wonderland, through the looking glass type of thing, a way to travel to different worlds through mirrors. But anyway, I thought that was really cool. And if you did too, feel free to get a copy of my book, FRACTAL, spuntoday.com/books/fractal. Shout out to my shameless plug. But yeah, I really like this movie. I liked the nostalgia of it. There was a bunch of, like I said, throwback lines, a bunch of these characters that I just mentioned from previous movies. Even the helicopter scene, in fighting scenes, there was a scene with the helicopter and the bullets jingling as they're falling down, and that fucking heavy artillery fucking machine gun is shooting from the helicopter. The scenes of stopping bullets when Neo's stopping bullets, checked off the nostalgia box. The scene where he's fighting Morpheus in that kung fu kind of temple, and they're having like their sparring session. That was really cool. Oh, a line that he said, instead of saying, I know Kung Fu, and then the original Morpheus, played by Lawrence Fishburne, tells him, show me. And they, go into the sparring program. In this one, when he starts fighting Smith for the first time, he says, I still know Kung Fu. And then he like fights him. And, a lot of the same like moves are like redone within the movie, within like the fight scenes and stuff like that, which is pretty cool. All that was dope. They introduced some new concepts, which was like instead of people, agents, turning into people, they said that they use bots like throughout like the Matrix, which are like zombies pretty much, that the machines can like take over. And there was a sick scene that was dope, but also kind of like freakishly reminiscent of like 9/11, where Trinity and Neo are like getting away in a motorcycle, and there's like everybody's being turned into bots, or like all the bots are being activated. They're like jumping off from buildings through their windows in their apartment buildings, falling, like splatting on the floor. They were just like using them as bombs, as like human bombs, which was like sick and cool at the same time. So they definitely introduced cool new anecdotes like that. Oh, by the way, I forgot to say that they explained why nobody knew who Neo was. Because to Neo, like we saw him as, Keanu Reeves, and Carrie-Anne Moss we saw as Trinity, but everybody else would see them differently. And there were like certain scenes where you see like the reflection of Neo in the mirror and he looks like someone else. Or Carrie-Anne Moss, we see her reflection on the table of a coffee house where she's having a coffee with Neo, and she looks a little bit different. She doesn't look like how we see her. And the fact that like her husband in the like Matrix simulation laughs at her when she says, don't you think that she looks like me, when she's speaking about Trinity? And he's like laughing at her because she does technically look like completely different. She's like blonde and just looks different. But the reveal from the Analyst is that he figured out the perfect combination of how to run a prosperous, stable Matrix. And he's been doing it for decades. And it was the reason why they chose to like rebuild Neo's body when he died and plug him back in. And similarly to Trinity when she died, because remember, she got like those barrillas like stuck in her when they crashed. And the Analyst said that they found that with only Neo, the Matrix wasn't as powerful or strong. And they figured out that when they put him and Trinity together and allowed them to, be together, they would just be like too powerful and they would just like fuck everything up. But if he kept them close but like far enough from each other where they, couldn't touch and interact and stuff, that made for a very stable and powerful Matrix. And you know how the concept of the Matrix is that we're all plugged in and we're like batteries for the machine world. He also explains how he uncovered that people, when they hate or when they feel like really strong emotions, they create much more energy than when they're happy. So there's no point to create like a utopia, perfect type of world, Matrix. And that's why in the past, it's never worked. The human being like rejected that utopia. And that's like great social commentary to how we are now in like real life, right? Like we're on social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, arguing with each other, being shitty with one another, clicking on headlines and things that feed our confirmation bias, which is driven by whatever bubble of information we're in. And we're really in the midst of a social type of pandemic where we seem to gravitate towards negativity and shittiness. And it becomes like a what came first, the chicken or the egg type of situation between, is it because that's what we're chasing, or is it because that's what we're being fed by the algorithms that we're caught within? And we're just like in this never ending cycle of bullshit and things that make us hate and feel stronger emotions, as articulated in the scene by the Analyst. Shout out once again to NPH. And then at the very, very end, we see that Trinity also makes the decision to get out the blue pill world. She reconnects with Neo. They kick the Analyst's ass. And in a pretty cool scene at the end, we see that like fly off together. Because in a previous scene, actually, where they both jump off a building away from like the helicopters like shooting them, Neo starts to flail and he like can't fly. But then Trinity has like the ability to fly. And she like flies them away to safety, which is pretty cool. And then it's that much sweeter to see them fly off at the end after telling the Analyst to fuck off, basically, and that they're gonna remake the world in their way, in their likeness, and show how love conquers all. But yeah, folks, I know I rambled like crazy on that one. This whole thing could be a podcast in and of itself, but that's just how much I liked it. I thought it was super creative, a really good time. I saw it twice, plan to watch it again, and I definitely recommend it. Matrix Resurrections. Check it out.